A lot of the debate around these NFL players kneeling seems to occur in a historical vacuum. The history of athletes and protest is seldom mentioned. And what's worse, the reason why Colin Kaepernick and his comrades began protesting during the national anthem has been drowned out in the shouting. Last week, I saw an image circulating online that showed Martin Luther King Jr. with his hand over his heart in respect for the American flag. It was accompanied by a message from a Trump supporter saying, MLK didn't take the knee in protest of the flag or anthem. He took the knee in prayer to God. That was followed by the hashtag boycott NFL. In fact, a lot of people on the right seem to love using King to defend all sorts of things, to defend guns. Would liberals want, King to not have been able to have a gun after his house was firebombed? They falsely claim that Martin Luther King was a member of the Republican Party. Martin Luther King has become a malleable symbol for rampant deployment by people trying to tell protesters and black people today to shut up. One of the biggest problems with all of this is that it's based on complete fiction and total ignorance of who Martin Luther King Jr. actually was and what he actually believed. It's also particularly vile when used to try to suppress dissent against police killings. The same thing that happens a lot with King also happens all the time with Rosa Parks. It happens with the civil rights movement in general. Caricatures have been created after being sanitized, historically revised, and made palatable for mass consumption and abuse by crass politicians. An important and groundbreaking new book coming out in January digs deep into this manufactured mythology surrounding Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and other figures and movements, and it provides a nuanced portrait of the truth. It's called A More Beautiful and Terrible History: The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History. Its author is Jean Theoharis. She's a professor of political science at Brooklyn College in New York. Jean Theoharis, welcome to Intercepted.
Thanks for having me.
Your overall view of how key historical figures or moments in the civil rights movement are kind of used or inaccurately portrayed in our current discourse, either by politicians or by ordinary people having arguments online.
I think what we've seen, and this has happened over the past number of decades, and I would argue since really Reagan changes his position and signs the King holiday, is the kind of creation of a national fable of the civil rights movement. And so now the civil rights movement is used to make Americans feel good about themselves. From 50th anniversary commemorations of the March on Washington to the Selma to Montgomery March, from the dedication of King's statue on the Mall, from the statue of Rosa Parks in Statuary Hall. All of these events have become places where we now celebrate the United States, where we feel so good about the progress we've made. And I think in the process, these kind of dangerous ideas about what the civil rights movement was, what it entailed, how it went forth, have become cemented. And so, as you're implying, politicians, citizens constantly invoke the civil rights movement in the present to justify certain kinds of positions, to chastise contemporary movements, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's Colin Kaepernick's stand that is now turned into a much broader stand by athletes. We're constantly being bombarded with, this is not what King would do, be like King, be like Parks, that strip and utterly distort what the civil rights movement was and what people like King and Parks actually did and stood for.
Right. And we interviewed Tavis Smiley, who wrote an excellent book about the last year of King's life, where King was basically disinvited to everything. He was no longer embraced by the mainstream of the civil rights movement, and he was increasingly denouncing U.S. imperialism, talking about how my own government is the greatest purveyor of violence on earth. It's the one King quote that I would love to see at an NFL game when they have all the rockets and the war craft flying over it. Let's put that Martin Luther King quote up about the U.S. government being the greatest purveyor of violence on earth.
Absolutely. But I think we also need to remember that even the King at the high water mark of 1963 is not popular. So in Gallup poll the week before the March on Washington, 2/3 of Americans don't support the March on Washington. You have congressmen denouncing it as un-American. And in the wake of the March on Washington, the FBI and the Kennedys, this is the moment when you see the escalation of surveillance of Martin Luther King to kind of wall-to-wall surveillance of him. They call him a demagogue, the most dangerous. Even in this moment, right, we're not even at 67 King with the public speech against the war in Vietnam. We are at King in the March on Washington, and that King is seen as dangerous, and that King is surveilled, right? It's not just 67 and 68 King.